Hey Reddit, I never thought I'd be posting here, but I'm at my wit's end and don't know what else to do. I guess I'll start with some background. My name's Jessica, I'm 18, and I live with my mom, Lisa, in a small suburban town. It's just been the two of us since my dad passed away when I was 10. We've always been close, like best friends more than mother and daughter. A few months ago, my mom started dating this guy named Greg. He's in his late 40s, tall, pretty good-looking, and smooth-talking in a way that makes you wonder if it's charming or calculated. At first, I was happy for my mom. She's had a rough time since losing my dad, and I figured she deserved to be happy. But from the beginning, something about Greg rubbed me the wrong way. He was overly friendly in this weird, slightly flirty way that didn't sit right with me. Like, instead of just saying hi when he came over, he'd say, "Wow, Jessica, you're growing into such a beautiful young woman." Sure, that might sound harmless, but it was the way he said it, like it wasn't just a compliment, but something loaded. At first, I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just overthinking it. Maybe I was jealous of the time he was taking away from me and my mom. But as the weeks went on, Greg's little comments and actions became harder to ignore. The worst part? My mom didn't seem to notice. She was totally smitten with him, constantly talking about how amazing and sweet he was. And I wanted to believe her. I really did. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Things with Greg started getting weird. It wasn't just his compliments anymore. He'd find excuses to touch me, like brushing his hand against mine when passing me something or giving me these overly long hugs when he greeted me. One evening, we were watching a movie in the living room, me on one end of the couch, Mom snuggled up with Greg on the other. Out of nowhere, he looks over and says, "You know, Jessica, you've got your mom's legs." Lucky girl. Mom laughed it off like it was a compliment, but I froze. What does that even mean? Why would you say something like that? I wanted to snap at him, but I didn't want to ruin the night. Mom seemed so happy, and I convinced myself I was imagining things. But then there were the texts. It started innocently enough. Greg texted me one evening to ask where my mom was because she wasn't picking up her phone. But after I responded, he texted back, "Thanks. I knew you'd help me out. You're a good girl, winky face." That winky face. It felt so wrong. The real turning point came a couple of weeks later. Mom was out running errands, and Greg came over earlier than expected for dinner. I was in my room when I heard him call out, "Hey, Jess, can you come here for a sec?" Reluctantly, I went downstairs, and there he was, standing in the kitchen with this sleazy grin. "Mind giving me a hand with this?" he asked, gesturing to the groceries Mom had asked him to bring. As I helped him unpack, he kept standing way too close, so close I could feel his breath on my neck. Then he leaned in and said, "You know, if I were a younger man, I'd have a hard time keeping my hands off you." I felt like my stomach dropped out of my body. I mumbled some excuse and bolted to my room, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I tried to process what just happened. That night, while scrolling on my phone, I decided to check Greg's Instagram. He had tagged my mom in a post about their amazing date night, and one of the pictures was of them at some fancy restaurant. But in the comments, someone had left a really weird message, "Still chasing the young ones, huh, Greg?" LMAO. Something about that comment sent chills down my spine. That comment stuck with me all night. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Still chasing the young ones felt like more than just a joke, it felt like a warning. I clicked on the commenter's profile, but it was private. Still, their bio had something interesting: "No secrets stay buried forever." My mind started racing. Who was this person? Did they know something about Greg that I didn't? The next day, I decided to do a little digging. I googled Greg's name and found his LinkedIn profile, some old Facebook photos, and a couple of public court records. One of those records was for a restraining order. It was filed 5 years ago by someone named Megan Johnson. The details weren't public, but the timeline matched what Greg had told my mom about his last relationship ending badly. He'd spun it like his ex was the crazy one, but now I wasn't so sure. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Greg wasn't just some creepy guy making inappropriate comments. He was dangerous. That night, I couldn't keep it in any longer. Mom and I were in the kitchen making dinner when I blurted out, "Mom, I need to talk to you about Greg." She looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" I took a deep breath. "He's weird with me. He says things that make me uncomfortable, and he's always finding excuses to touch me." Her face fell, but then she frowned. "Jess, are you sure you're not overreacting? Greg's just friendly. He doesn't mean anything by it." I could feel my anger bubbling up. "Mom, he told me if he were younger, he'd have a hard time keeping his hands off me. Does that sound friendly to you?" Her expression shifted to shock, but then, almost instantly, she started defending him. "He probably didn't mean it that way. You know how some people just have bad social skills." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom, I'm not imagining this. Look, I even found this online." I showed her the restraining order, but she just shook her head. "That doesn't prove anything," she said, her voice tight. "People can file restraining orders for all kinds of reasons. You don't know the full story." At that moment, I realized she wasn't ready to believe me, or couldn't. Either way, I was on my own. After my mom's reaction, I felt completely alone. I couldn't believe she was so willing to brush off what I was telling her. For a few days, I just kept to myself, avoiding Greg as much as possible. But every time he came over, I could feel his eyes on me, and it made my skin crawl. One night, while scrolling through Instagram again, I remembered the weird comment on Greg's post. "Still chasing the young ones, huh, Greg? LMAO." The commenter's bio stuck in my head, "No secrets stay buried forever." I decided to take a chance. I messaged them. "Hey, I noticed your comment on Greg's post. Do you know him? I think he might be bothering someone I care about, and I don't know what to do." I didn't expect a response, but within an hour, my phone buzzed. "Yeah, I know Greg. Who are you, and what's going on?" I told them everything, the comments, the touching, the restraining order I found. They messaged back almost immediately. "I'm Megan." "The restraining order?" "That's me. He's bad news. You need to get away from him before it gets worse." My heart was racing. "Worse?" I asked. "What happened with you?" Megan's response sent chills down my spine. "He started with comments, then touching. When I tried to break things off, he wouldn't leave me alone. He followed me to work, sent me inappropriate texts, and even tried to blackmail me. He's a predator. Don't let your guard down." Armed with Megan's warning, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. I needed to protect myself and convince my mom that Greg was dangerous. That weekend, Greg came over for dinner. I stayed in my room most of the evening, but as I walked to the kitchen to grab some water, he cornered me in the hallway. "You've been avoiding me," he said, blocking my path. I stepped back, my heart pounding. "I've just been busy." He smirked, leaning in closer. "You're such a beautiful girl, Jessica. It's hard not to notice." I felt sick. "Excuse me," I muttered, pushing past him and practically running back to my room. I locked the door and texted Megan immediately. "He's getting worse. What do I do?" Her reply was swift and firm. "Document everything. Keep records of what he says and does. You need proof, especially if your mom isn't on your side." That night, I downloaded a voice recorder app on my phone and decided I'd start gathering evidence. If my mom wouldn't believe me, I'd make sure she had no choice. But I had no idea how fast things were about to spiral. The next time Greg came over, I was ready. I stayed in the living room with my phone in my pocket, the voice recorder app running. My heart was pounding, but I forced myself to act normal. At first, Greg didn't say much, just his usual charming, small talk. But then, as I got up to grab a drink, he followed me into the kitchen. "You know," he said in that low, slimy tone, "you don't have to be so shy around me. I don't bite, unless you want me to." I froze, gripping the counter to keep my hand steady. I'm not shy, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Greg chuckled, leaning closer. Oh, come on. I see the way you look at me. It's okay to admit it. I didn't respond. Instead, I grabbed my drink and walked out of the room, my whole body shaking. Once I was safely in my room, I stopped the recording and played it back. Hearing his voice made my stomach turn, but it also gave me a strange sense of power. Now I had proof. That night, I waited until Greg left before confronting my mom again. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely oblivious to how tense I was. Mom, we need to talk, I said, sitting down across from her. She looked up, sighing. Jess, if this is about Greg again. It is, I interrupted. But this time I have proof. Her brows furrowed. Proof of what? I pulled out my phone and played the recording. Her face went pale as Greg's voice filled the room, dripping with innuendo. When it ended, she sat there in stunned silence. Do you believe me now? I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and desperation. She shook her head, as if trying to clear her thoughts. I don't know what to say. Say you'll kick him out of our lives, I demanded. He's not just creepy, Mom, he's dangerous. I talked to his ex, Megan. She told me what he did to her. Do you really want to wait until he does something worse? Mom's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might finally take my side. But then she said, I need to talk to him about this. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Talk to him? Are you serious? You think he's just going to admit it and walk away? I need to hear his side, she insisted, her voice cracking. Jess, this is a lot to process. Just, give me time. Time. That was all she ever asked for. But I didn't have time to wait. Mom must have called Greg that night because the next time he came over, he looked pissed. I stayed in my room, determined to avoid him, but it didn't take long before I heard raised voices, coming from the living room. Are you serious, Lisa? Greg barked. You're really going to believe your kid over me? I would never hurt her. I don't know what to believe, Mom said, her voice shaky. But she has a recording, Greg. I can't just ignore that. You're blowing this out of proportion, he snapped. She's probably making it up, because she doesn't like me. I couldn't listen to it anymore. I opened my door and walked into the living room, my phone in hand. She didn't make it up, I said, glaring at him. I've got more if you want to hear them. Greg turned to me, his face dark with anger. Stay out of this, Jessica. This is between me and your mom. No, it's not, I shot back. You made it about me the second you started harassing me. For a second, I thought he might try to intimidate me, but then he turned back to my mom. See what I mean? She's making this a bigger deal than it is. Mom looked torn, her hands trembling as she held on to the edge of the couch. Greg, I think you should leave, she said finally. He didn't argue, but the look he gave me as he left sent a chill down my spine. I thought that was the end of it. Greg was gone, and I hoped Mom would finally see him for who he really was. But the next morning, I found a note slipped under my bedroom door. It wasn't handwritten, it was printed, like something you'd type out on a computer. Stay out of my way, Jessica. You don't know who you're messing with. My blood ran cold. I didn't tell Mom about the note right away, I didn't want to scare her, and honestly, I wasn't sure how she'd react after everything. Instead, I texted Megan. She replied almost instantly. He did the same thing to me when I tried to leave. It's his way of keeping control. Don't let him scare you, just document everything and go to the police if it gets worse. That was the last thing I wanted to do, but I knew Megan was right. I took a picture of the note and saved it on my phone, just in case. Later that day, I finally showed it to Mom. She stared at it for a long time, her face pale. Why didn't you tell me about this sooner? She asked. Because I didn't think you'd believe me, I said bluntly. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time, she looked genuinely shaken. I'm so sorry, Jess. I should have listened to you sooner. It felt like a small victory, but I knew we weren't out of the woods yet. After showing Mom the note, things finally started to change. She admitted that she'd been blinded by her feelings for Greg and promised to cut ties with him. But Greg wasn't going to make it easy. Mom blocked his number, but that didn't stop him from showing up at the house the next evening. I was in my room when I heard him pounding on the front door, yelling, "Lisa, open up. We need to talk." I grabbed my phone and ran to the living room, where Mom stood frozen by the door. "Don't open it," I said firmly. "Call the police." She hesitated but nodded, picking up her phone. Meanwhile, Greg's shouting grew louder. "Jessica's filling your head with lies. Let me in, so we can clear this up." The dispatcher on the other end of the line assured us an officer was on the way. Mom relayed the information, her voice trembling, while I recorded everything on my phone. When the police arrived, Greg tried to play it cool, insisting it was just a misunderstanding. But the officers weren't buying it. They warned him to leave the property and not return or risk being charged with trespassing. As he walked away, he glared at me one last time. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. The officers assured us that we could file for a restraining order if Greg continued to harass us. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we had some control. The next day, Mom and I sat down together to figure out our next steps. "I should have trusted you from the start," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "I'm so sorry, Jess. I'll never doubt you again." Her words meant a lot, but I knew we weren't out of danger yet. Greg wasn't the type to give up easily. That's when I remembered Megan. She'd been through this before and might know what to do next. I reached out to her again, explaining everything that had happened since we last talked. Her reply was immediate. "I'm not surprised. He's done this before with other women, too. If you're ready, I can connect you with someone who helped me get a restraining order." Megan's contact turned out to be a legal advocate who specialized in helping victims of harassment and abuse. With her guidance, Mom and I started gathering all the evidence we had: texts, the recording, the note, and the video of Greg yelling outside our house. As we prepared to file for the restraining order, Megan messaged me again. "There's one more thing you should know. Greg's been arrested before, for harassment and stalking. It's public record if you search for it." I did, and what I found made my stomach turn. Greg had a history of targeting vulnerable women, charming them, and then turning controlling and dangerous. One of his exes had even accused him of physical abuse, though the charges were dropped. When I showed Mom the records, she broke down in tears. "How could I have been so blind?" she whispered. "It's not your fault," I said, squeezing her hand. "But now we know who he really is. And we're not going to let him get away with it." With the legal advocate's help, we filed for a restraining order against Greg. The court hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, and during that time, we did everything we could to prepare. Mom even went to therapy to process what had happened and understand how Greg had manipulated her. The day of the hearing, my stomach was in knots. Mom and I walked into the courthouse together, armed with all the evidence we'd gathered: texts, recordings, the note, and Megan's written statement about her experiences with Greg. Greg showed up looking smug, like he thought he could charm his way out of it. But when the judge began reviewing the evidence, his confidence started to crack. My recording of Greg's creepy comments played loud and clear in the courtroom. The judge's face grew stony as Greg's voice filled the room. "You don't have to be so shy around me. I don't bite, unless you want me to." Greg tried to argue that the recording was taken out of context, but the judge wasn't having it. Then we presented the note he'd left under my door, followed by the video of him yelling outside our house. Finally, Mom spoke. Her voice trembled, but she held her ground. "I ignored the signs, because I wanted to believe the best in him. But now I see how dangerous he is, not just to me, but to my daughter." Greg didn't say a word. He just sat there, his face red and his jaw clenched. When the judge announced the restraining order would be granted, I felt a weight lift off my chest. For the first time in weeks, I felt safe. As we left the courthouse, Mom turned to me. "Jess, I owe you everything. You were brave when I wasn't, and you saved us both. I didn't know what to say, so I just hugged her tightly. With the restraining order in place, Greg was finally out of our lives. The first few days after the hearing were quiet, almost too quiet. Mom and I kept looking over our shoulders, half expecting Greg to show up, but he didn't. Over time, the anxiety started to fade, and we began to rebuild our sense of normalcy. Mom threw herself into therapy and started reconnecting with old friends she'd distanced herself from while dating Greg. She even apologized to me again, this time with tears in her eyes. I can't believe I let someone like him into our home, she said one evening. You trusted me to protect you, and I failed. But I promise, Jess, I'll never let anything like this happen again. Hearing her say that meant everything to me. As for me, I started feeling stronger too. Megan and I kept in touch, and she told me how proud she was that I stood up to Greg. You did what so many of us couldn't, she said in one of her messages. Life didn't go back to normal overnight, but it did go on. We got new locks for the house, installed a security system, and took a self-defense class together. It felt empowering, like we were taking control of our lives again. A few months later, Mom met someone new. At first, I was skeptical, terrified, even. But this guy, Mark, was completely different from Greg. He was kind, respectful, and took things slow. Most importantly, he treated both of us with care. One night, while sitting on the porch with Mom, she turned to me and said, "You know, I've learned a lot from this. Not just about men, but about listening, to you, to my gut, to the people who care about me." I smiled, feeling a deep sense of relief. We've both learned a lot, I said. And we're stronger for it. Greg's shadow no longer loomed over us. Instead, it became a reminder of what we'd survived and how far we'd come. Mom and I had always been close, but after everything we went through, our bond felt unbreakable. And in the end, that's what mattered most.